this is not getting discussed on the mainstream media. Not only are they wrong legally, but the fact that they would do this is outrageous. This is an overreaction and really nonsense. How would you react if this was your son or your daughter? It's the offense of knowing the truth. It's the offense of having an alternate worldview. Saying God bless you to someone is not a violation of the law.
Welcome to the broadcast, everyone. We put together a very special documentary, a portion of which you're going to see on this television broadcast. In fact, the entire documentary, called Tax Invasion, is available as a free digital download. You can watch it for free online at irsmovie.com. Now, what you're going to see in the next few moments are interviews with key leaders in Washington, D.C., talking about why it is that the IRS made the determination to target Christian and conservative organizations. Now let's take a look at the movie, Tax Invasion.
Welcome back to Hannity. Breaking news out of Washington. A bombshell admission by the IRS. The tax agency is officially apologizing for subjecting conservative groups to additional scrutiny during the 2012 election.
Jay Sekulow is an attorney and chief counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice. He represented 27 of the groups targeted by the agency. They admit they did it because you forced them to admit they did it.
We applied for our tax status in 2010. We waited 18 months. They sent these letters that wanting a lot of information they weren't allowed to ask us.
Send us your Facebook pages, your Twitter pages. And I said, does that include personal pages? And they said everything. They wanted to know your personal relationships with politicians and political parties. And they made an insinuation like, look, it can be considered perjury if you omit things from the IRS, and that carries with it jail time. I'm a pregnant stay-at-home mother on one income. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not doing anything.
Lois Lerner oversees tax-exempt organizations for the IRS.
They used names like Tea Party or Patriots, and they selected cases simply because the application had those names in the title. That was wrong. The IRS would like to apologize for that.
Oh, okay, thank you. I appreciate. Wait a minute! I didn't realize apologies were sufficient in IRS-related issues.
Well, tell us about the derivation of your organization's name, especially if you had Liberty in there.
This is Chicago thug politics.
What the IRS did here is outrageous.
It's an evil agency, and I hope the American people will get up in arms about it.
If, in fact, IRS personnel engaged in the kind of practices that have been reported on and were intentionally targeting conservative groups, then that's outrageous.
Really? It's not an if.
This isn't speculation. They're admitting it.
If this just isn't a gathering of an enemies list, I don't know what is.
They've apologized for it, which, by the way, the apology is not accepted. The president needs to stop the if and get to the reality here that this was a complete misuse of the Office of the Internal Revenue Service.
Has a crime been committed here?
I have not violated any IRS rules or regulations, and I have not provided false information to this or any other congressional committee. After very careful consideration, I've decided to follow my counsel's advice and not testify or answer any of the questions today.
There needs to be government oversight here of why this happened, who let it happen, and why, when it was known by the top that it was going on, that they didn't stop it.
Wow. Jay Sekulow, thank you, sir.
I'm Jay Sekulow, the chief counsel of the ACLJ, a global public interest law firm that has been in existence for over 20 years. Throughout this time, we've been primarily known as an organization handling religious liberty cases, including cases at the Supreme Court of the United States. But my career right out of law school actually began at the Office of the Chief Counsel for the IRS. Because of my experience with the IRS, when we started getting word about the targeting of organizations back in 2011, I knew, based on what I have experienced as an IRS lawyer, that what happened was no accident. The targeting that took place was wrong, it was illegal and unconstitutional. But I don't want you to take just my word for it. I brought in many of my friends who've had real-world experience and political experience dealing with the IRS. I was recently in Washington, D.C. and had the chance to sit down with my friend Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann. She has been a strong and consistent voice for the victims of the IRS targeting abuse. What you may not know is that Congressman Bachmann, like me, worked in the Office of Chief Counsel at the IRS at the beginning of her career. Let's start with some common experience that you and I both had, and that was as this IRS scandal was first made public, the argument was that the White House was putting out, and the IRS for that matter, was this was 2 rogue agents in a field office in Cincinnati. And you and I have represented those field office agents, and we knew it wasn't true.
Right, and I was a federal tax litigation attorney in the Office of Chief Counsel. Those are the lawyers for the IRS that represent the cases, whether it's civil cases, criminal cases, that's what we do. So we deal with everyone up and down the food chain in the IRS, whether it's IRS agents or appeals agents or revenue or collection, we deal with all of them.
Right.
And during the course of this story, as it began to unfold, I knew immediately, as I'm sure you did, that it was impossible that it was 2 low-level, they made it very clear it was low-level staffers who were rogue who had made this independent decision. I knew it was impossible because in my office I had books this thick. They were operation manuals of standard operating procedures, so when I did my work as a federal tax lawyer, I had to check every box to make sure that I didn't do anything out of the norm. And once my work product was completed, that went to my supervisor, that went to his supervisor, on up the food chain, so to speak, to make sure that everything I did was carefully done so that no taxpayer's information would ever have an unauthorized disclosure.
Right.
That's how careful the IRS was, because people's privacy was highly respected. And I can say with certainty whether people were left-leaning or right-leaning, that is what our mission was, to make sure that we correctly dealt with the tax law, but also no unauthorized disclosure.
I never had a situation in hundreds of cases where the agents, freewheeling, started writing letters with questions in it like this. You mentioned the Internal Revenue Manual, that's what we called it. The IRMs would be sitting in our desks, and these agents had the same thing. They had for their audits, they had their checklists. So when those letters came out asking people for membership lists, if they prayed with another person, what their content of their prayer was, why they have a pro-life position, there is no way that those agents on their own could have done that.
I'm glad you're bringing it up, because your son, Jordan Sekulow, was with myself. We had a major press conference here just a stone's throw from where the ACLJ office is right now. And we had from across the nation members of the Tea Party, and one after another they went to the microphone and told their story, which is the IRS wanted to know the content of our prayers because we were for the state of Israel. All of the reasons that they were giving these questions, I'd never heard of anything like that before, because we were supposed to focus on, do you have the correct deductions? Do you have the right credits? Are you overstating your income? Are you overstating deductions? Are you understating income? Those are the kind of things we looked for. We never looked for ideology. It didn't matter what you thought about ideology. This was a case of first impression. I have never before seen an instance where the IRS was interested in what you thought. Before, the IRS was only interested, are you paying what you're supposed to pay? And that's what the IRS was supposed to be about.
The Internal Revenue Service scandal is getting worse. Now there are new revelations of the IRS targeting Tea Party and conservative groups, disturbing admissions that the IRS scheme was even more partisan and more coordinated than previously thought. The American Center for Law and Justice represents 41 groups in a federal lawsuit challenging the IRS. We intend to get to the bottom of this unlawful and unconstitutional scheme. An out-of-control IRS that intentionally targeted conservative organizations, violating their First Amendment rights. Stand with the ACLJ now. Sign on to our petition to end IRS abuse. Add your name by calling 1-877-989-2255. That's 1-877-989-2255 or online, aclj.org.
Herman Cain is a name that anyone who followed the 2012 elections for president should know. I decided to bring him into the conversation because of his background as a businessman and an economist, along with his active role in the Tea Party movement. Although we're not in the same area often, Herman and I have been able to keep in touch with each other over these important matters.
When I heard that the IRS was targeting the Tea Party groups and other conservative groups, I was appalled. Never did I expect for it to be so blatant as when they came after Tea Party and other conservative groups. So like you and many others, I was flabbergasted and also outraged over the fact that an agency that is supposed to be working for the people was really working against the people.
I think right now, and I'd like your opinion on this, tax reform is a significant issue for the American people right now.
I take it to another level, Jay. Tax replacement. Have you noticed that in the narrative part of the politicians, they won't use the word replace? You don't have that in the public narrative anywhere. And so that's why I, along with my senior economic advisor, created 999. Number one, because we needed to change the narrative to replace. We needed to bring a focus on the biggest fiscal issue that we had, which was economic growth, the lack thereof, and starting with replacing the tax code was going to do it. The other reason that we developed 999 is because having worked with tax replacement systems like the flat tax and the fair tax for over 15 years, I knew that we needed to have something that would bring the flat tax people to the same table with the fair tax people. That's how we came up with the 999, because as you know, the first 9 is a corporate flat tax with a minor deduction. Second 9 is the personal flat tax, and then the third 9 is a national sales tax. Replacing the tax code is the narrative that I and others in my organization want to create over the next several months to get to the point where we can demand that Congress do something about it.
Does that mean we scrap the Internal Revenue Code as we know it?
Yes, we scrap the Internal Revenue Code as we know it. It's 100 years old, and for 100 years we have been lied to about reform. The closest we ever came to real reform was in 1986 under President Ronald Reagan. He was able to get some simplification. He was able to get some additional reduction in rates. But then, as politics and bureaucrats have it, since 1986, Jay, it has continued to grow and mushroom and bloom again. Why? There's an element in Washington, D.C. called lobbyists. And lobbyists have one primary objective: to try and get some favors for whoever it is that they represent in the tax code. So let's rip out the heart of the problem and replace the tax code with either one of the flat tax, the fair tax, or 999, which would be fairer, simpler for all Americans, but more importantly, it would put the power back in the hands of the people, out of the hands of the IRS, and out of the hands of the bureaucrats and the politicians.
While I was in D.C., I met with a longtime friend and pro-life leader, Reverend Rob Schenck. Rob currently serves as the president of Faith in Action, a donor-based nonprofit organization whose ministry is focused on America's government leaders in Washington, D.C. You may wonder what he has to do with this conversation. You're never going to believe the story he has to tell.
In 2009, I was in our building, and the knock came on the door. And I usually don't answer the door after hours. There are security issues. There's all kinds of reasons I wouldn't. But I did. On this occasion, I happened to open the door, and the first thing I saw was a badge. And the woman who was holding the badge said, IRS, sir, I need to speak with you.
Did she know who you were? Or she just was...
No.
No, okay. She didn't know who you were at that point, but she knew the organization.
And she said, what is your position with the organization? I said, I'm the president. She said, well, I need to come in and ask you some questions. And I had been told all my professional career, don't pick a fight with the IRS. You will lose. That was the rule. I can only be on the losing end of that equation. So, maybe naively, but I invited her in. I was very cordial, very cooperative. But the first thing she asked me for was literature on our organization.
So the agent asked you a series of questions and wants to see your literature.
Wants to see our literature, wanted to see a list of our top donors.
First of all, what did you say to her?
And I remember saying, I don't know if I'm comfortable doing that. She said, sir, it doesn't matter whether you're comfortable or not. You have to show it to me. And I'm a layman in the law. I'm looking at a woman with a badge, and I know the IRS can create a lot of trouble for an organization like ours, even if we're in the right.
Right.
I know they can drain our time, energy, effort, resources. I'm going to admit, I just kind of folded. I said, whatever you need to see, we will make available to you. She said, well, I'll be back. And she was several times.
Did she know why she was there, the agent?
I'm not sure the agent ever really knew why she was there. She was a very young woman, obviously new in her career. And she seemed herself a little befuddled. In fact, a few times she apologized to me. She did have she paid certain deference to my status as a clergyman. She kept saying, Reverend, I'm sorry, but I need to ask for this stuff. You need to produce this. I need to follow this up. The whole thing just didn't seem businesslike. Finally, she said, well, sir, there is a matter of a unpaid balance of $250 that dates, I think, to 2008. I can't remember the year. It seemed absurd. I said, we will cut you a check. In fact, I remember laughing and saying, would you like it in cash? She continued. She had made at least a couple of visits after that, always asking for literature,
and
for records of donors and donations. And I do recall saying to my own staff, I'm very concerned that they're creating a target list. All you have to do is start harassing donors to an organization like ours to undermine the organization. The last correspondence I saw was April of 2011, when finally everything went quiet.
April of 2011 was when the subsequent meetings took place between the IRS Chief Counsel's office and the staff on the tax exempt, and they were changing the profiles of who they were going to go after.
Well, everything just grew suddenly silent.
What happened to you on the stopping of the communication in April of 2011 happened with 41 of our clients. The communication basically stopped because the IRS was caught with their hands in the cookie jar.
I felt we had been targeted. I felt like we had been harassed. You feel violated in a way. We have legal rights. We do everything possible to comply with the law. So to have somebody at the door with a badge and to have somebody making demands on you without offering a really good reason for it, you feel intimidated.
Do you feel like you were part of that target?
I absolutely feel like we were targeted. I think the investigation, whatever it was, as unprofessional as it was absolutely unwarranted. And then to not even have closure, for it to simply dissolve into the shadows.
To this day.
To this day. Made it that much more incredible.
As you've just heard, we are mounting a huge campaign to stop the abuse of the Internal Revenue Service from engaging in this kind of unconstitutional targeting of Christian and conservative organizations. To that end, we have a petition up to stop the IRS abuse. Over 130,000 signatures already. We're going to present those to members of Congress. That's where you come in. We need your help on this. Join with us. We don't think it's appropriate for the government to be asking people the content of their prayers. If you agree with me, go to ACLJ.org and sign the petition right now, or call us at 1-877-989-2255. That's ACLJ.org or 1-877-989-2255. Again, the IRS not only targeting conservative organizations, but Christian organizations as well, and asking them about the contents of their prayer activity. If you object to that, and I'm sure you do, join with over 130,000 other Americans at ACLJ.org or 1-877-989-2255. Back with more from our movie Tax Invasion in just a moment.
The Internal Revenue Service scandal is getting worse. Now there are new revelations of the IRS targeting Tea Party and conservative groups, disturbing admissions that the IRS scheme was even more partisan and more coordinated than previously thought. The American Center for Law and Justice represents 41 groups in a federal lawsuit challenging the IRS. We intend to get to the bottom of this unlawful and unconstitutional scheme. An out-of-control IRS that intentionally targeted conservative organizations, violating their First Amendment rights. Stand with the ACLJ now. Sign on to our petition to end IRS abuse. Add your name by calling 1-877-989-2255. That's 1-877-989-2255 or online, aclj.org.
I have ordered an investigation to be begun. The FBI is coordinating with the Justice Department to see if any laws were broken in connection.
I believe there's been a pattern by this administration in not taking responsibility for failures avoiding blame, pointing the fingers in somebody else's direction. Would you agree with that?
No.
Our media offices are specifically not located in Washington, D.C. This gives our team a clear vision of what America wants and removes the chance of influence from the Beltway. However, from time to time, the schedules of leaders in faith, media, and politics line up with ours. Senator Rand Paul happened to be in town and stopped by our office to discuss the importance of this issue. Along with his role in the Senate and being an outspoken icon with the Tea Party movement, he is an ophthalmologist with an MD from Duke and plays an interesting role in this conversation.
Your sense of the political motivations here. The IRS is trying to do a bit of a mea culpa, but the president keeps calling these phony scandals. These are not real.
Well, I think the American people, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, they're horrified at this because no one wants to think, you know what, I supported one candidate, the other guy won, and now I'm going to be audited or punished or have my business closed down, my religion challenged, my political beliefs challenged. Nobody really wants that to happen in government. So this is really, I think of all the scandals that are going on, one of the most offensive. And I think it'll continue to go. The other thing I think that really gets to me about this is that when you look at contributions from the IRS union, they gave over $1 million in the last 2 cycles, all to Democrats. And so really the question is, are they sitting over at the IRS from top to bottom looking who you contributed to and deciding whether to audit you? So I think not only do the perpetrators need to be fired and or imprisoned, I think you need to look from top to bottom and really should government employees be involved with contributing to one party versus the other.
The president came out when the scandal first was really hit the media with the Inspector General. They tried to get ahead of the Inspector General report. And he said he was outraged. It was horrible what happened. He then instructed his Attorney General, Eric holder, to take direct action. Eric Holder was the one who inserted that this may in fact be criminal. Yet I represent 41 of the groups that were targeted, and some of the small ones and large ones. No one's been contacted by the FBI. There's been no investigations done. Do you think these were political statements that the White House was trying to do? We now know, of course, it's going much higher up the internally than we initially thought. But what's your sense of the reaction?
It's like so many other responses from President Obama. He says the right thing, and you want to believe him. After Benghazi, he said he was going to fire the people who were responsible, but no one's been fired. After the IRS scandal, has anybody really been fired? Someone resigned, but I think they were planning on resigning. The main person who took the Fifth Amendment, my understanding, she's still being paid, correct?
Yes, she is. Lois Lerner is still on the government's payroll, and she had actually access to her computers until a few weeks ago.
And here's the other point. If she's convicted, will she still get her pension? She apparently has a decade-long history of this. George Will reported that when she was at the FEC, she told a Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate, we'll leave you alone, we'll drop the charges if you just promise never to run for office again. That's the kind of bully nature we don't want our government involved in.
When you first heard about the IRS targeting, what was your reaction?
It was almost disbelief. And then when I heard that some of these groups were being asked what books you read, what kind of country would we live in where the tax agency is asking people what kind of books they read? And really, I think it's done for intimidation factor. There are many people in churches where the ministers are afraid to speak out because they've been threatened that their tax-exempt status will be taken away from them. Here, we're not threatening to take it away. We're just threatening never to give you tax-exempt status.
You mentioned pastors in the pulpit. They are intimidated. They're intimidated about the IRS. They're afraid to speak out on issues of the day. They get notices from groups that say, if you speak out on behalf of a candidate for public office, we're going to complain to the IRS and get your tax-exempt status, which the tax code actually does not say. And the First Amendment really says the opposite. What would you tell pastors?
Don't be afraid. Speak out. No one's ever been prosecuted. No one's ever had their tax-exempt status taken away. So don't be afraid. And if you don't speak out now, someday it'll be too late. And there's so many things where government is encroaching on us that we do need to be bold. We need to speak out, and people need to be unafraid. No one thinks that your government ought to be able to target you for your religious or your political beliefs.
So on this targeting, we got the IRS makes an admission that they in fact engaged in targeting. The Attorney General says he's going to open up a criminal investigation. So we have the FBI investigating the IRS. The FBI is investigating themselves and the Department of Justice on other matters. You've got all this swirling scandal going on. Yet you said something that I think is really important. A lot of people get intimidated when it's the IRS. We know that the IRS leaked donor information to not just individual media personnel, but actually leak the information to a group on the other side of the debate.
The other question I have is, where's the taxpayer watchdog? Many years ago, we set up a position of taxpayer watchdog, sort of to have an advocate for the taxpayer within the structure of government, so not everybody was just against the taxpayer, someone would actually be there for. I haven't seen any report of what the taxpayer watchdog's doing on this.
The taxpayer advocate, they're now called, and you're right, we have one. She said that these groups should be given $1,000 for their trouble and aggravation. That was her response.
Some of them are still waiting on their status, right?
Most of them are.
What do you think their attorneys are paid for this? Over years and years, just doing this part-time, trying to get your status. I'm sure it costs more than $1,000 over a 2-year period.
A lot
to try
more
to get
than that.
Status.
And what happened in this, Senator, and it's happened to folks in Kentucky, it's happened around the country, and that is this process is going on for some of these groups up to 3 years. And we just had the IRS, through the Department of Justice, come back and say, well, listen, we'll give expedited review to these nonprofit groups if, in fact, they will agree to expend only 40% of their funds and volunteer efforts on political activity. But the law says 49%. But if you'll surrender 9% of your constitutional rights, we'll give you expedited review. These applications have been pending for 3 years. Most of them over the last, I'd say, 6 months, no activity.
I think maybe it's a culture at the IRS, that the culture is that you can use the bully nature of your power to go after people you don't like.
That's going to do it for this version, or this portion of our movie Tax Invasion. Again, irsmovie.com if you want to see the entire movie, and I encourage you to watch it. It gives you an in-depth look at what the IRS was up to, what the IRS is still doing, and how we're fighting back. The idea, again, that the content of your prayers would be targeted by the IRS seems absurd, but it's actually happening, and it happened in writing from the IRS to our clients. So we're fighting back. Again, the movie's called Tax Invasion. You can watch it for free at irsmovie.com. And if you want to help us end the abuse of what the IRS is engaged in, there's an easy way for you to do it. 130,000 people have already signed on to a petition to stop the IRS abuse. I encourage you to add your name as well. You can do so at aclj.org. That's aclj.org, or you can call us at 1-877-989-2255. That's aclj.org, or 1-877-989-2255. Join with us if you want to stop government interference with prayer.
The Internal Revenue Service scandal is getting worse. Now there are new revelations of the IRS targeting Tea Party and conservative groups, disturbing admissions that the IRS scheme was even more partisan and more coordinated than previously thought. The American Center for Law and Justice represents 41 groups in a federal lawsuit challenging the IRS. We intend to get to the bottom of this unlawful and unconstitutional scheme. An out-of-control IRS that intentionally targeted conservative organizations, violating their First Amendment rights. Stand with the ACLJ now. Sign on to our petition to end IRS abuse. Add your name by calling 1-877-989-2255. That's 1-877-989-2255 or online, aclj.org.